Hello, my name is Naworska. I am a PhD student from Wrocław University of Science and Technology. Today I'm going to present you the presentation called The Concept of Connecting the City with the Region, the idea of the Garden City in Wrocław. Firstly, I will remind you the Garden City idea. Then I will introduce two concepts of development in Wrocław at the beginning of 20th century, the visions of two famous architects, Max Berg and Ernst May. Then I will also show you one of the most beautiful garden cities in Wrocław, Karłowice. At the dawn of the 20th century, an attempt to implement the utopian vision of an ideal city was to apply the concept of the garden city, formulated and propagated by Ebenezer Howard. The idea of the garden city was to solve the problem of overcrowding and the low standards of living of the inhabitants of large cities. Howard's Tomorrow, A Peaceful Path to Real Reform was published in London in 1898 and entered England's current political and economic situation. The Socialist Party was becoming more and more popular. They discussed the scope of housing policy. In 1902, a modified edition of The Garden City of Tomorrow was published. According to Howard, who presented his concept concerning London, the Garden City was supposed to be a way to eliminate overpopulation in big cities. In addition, the implementation provided people with healthy and peaceful living conditions, but most of all, guaranteed work in the satellite city. Howard illustrated this idea with a diagram of three magnets. The first is the city, describing its all disadvantages: high rents, polluted air, and advantages: well-lit streets, social life. The second is the countryside, with advantages such as natural beauty, fresh air, and low rent, but on the other hand with no social life and low wages. The third magnet is the town country, called the Garden City, which combines all the advantages of the city and the village while eliminating their disadvantages. Garden City is an organized independent structure, several dozen kilometers away from the large city, but conveniently connected with it. The first attempt to build one satellite city in the vicinity of London was Letchworth Garden City, the construction of which began in 1903. Two architects planned it, Barry Parker and Raymond Unwin. Howard's abstract diagram was modified due to the need to adapt to the specific site. Their area, which was approximately two-thirds of the postulated 2,400 hectares. In addition, the project, developed following Howard's recommendation, had to take into account the existing railway line running through the center of the land, intended for development. The station was to be an essential point in the city, connecting the road system and the nearby industrial zone. As Howard advised, there is a plaza in the center of Letchworth, which is the center of development. The first garden city laid out along the north-south axis. No more than 30 houses were to be built on 1 hectare, and each garden was from 300 to 500 square meters. The placement of the greenery around and development areas, green belts, and the many parks, squares, and tree-lined alleys made Letchworth resemble a rural development, and at the same time has the right to be called a garden city. Both middle class and the blue-collar workers could live in such an environment, and lease terms were very favorable and the fees were deficient. However, this didn't happen, as speculatively increased prices accompanied the increased demand for land. The first garden city developed slowly despite favorable circumstances, both in the residential and industrial zones. The slow development was interrupted by the outbreak of World War I. After its completion, state aid was necessary for the city to develop further. The response to the Garden Cities of Tomorrow in Germany was swift. The Garden City movement, which originated in England, resulted in the creation of the Deutsche Gartengesellschaft Society in 1902. The activities of the organization resulted in numerous realizations. The list began with the Hellerau near Dresden, 1907, erected on the initiative of the Werkbund, designed by Richard Riemer-Schmidt, under the artistic protectorate of Hermann Muthesius, Theodor Fischer, and Heinrich Tessenov. Unquestionable merits from the propagation of the idea of the garden cities in Germany were made by the great enthusiasts of this movement, Bernhard Kampffmeyer, the first chairman of the Deutsche Gartengesellschaft, and the Kampfkampfmeier, the general secretary of the association from 1906 to 1910, and a member of the Werkbund. However, what made the Garden City movement so famous? First, much of to remember the housing situation at the end of 19th century in German cities. Overpopulation, land speculation, and the rental houses, where poor sanitary conditions prevailed, and fees were extremely high. At the same time, public criticism of the situation began. The movement of hygienists and supporters of social policy became active. The growing supporters for socialism, also utopian, and the concept of Karl Marx, especially those relating to collective life, cannot be forgotten either. Criticism became more common and practical solutions to the housing issue had to be found. Garden City and the functional and comfortable interiors of English houses were considered a solution. A great promoter of English housing construction was Hermann Muthesius, a former cultural attaché at the German embassy in London, author of the publication Das Englische Haus. A house of this type, situated among greenery and adapted to the owner's needs, was to become a source of peace and vital energy for its residents. As activists from Deutsche Gartenstadtgesellschaft claimed, the Garden City was the place where people would be brought up in the community through contact through art, crafts, and music, in a word, through the some entire surrounding space. In Wrocław, as in the whole of Germany and other European countries, two basic city development methods competed. The first, by territorial expansion, decentralization and loosening, proposed by Max Berg. In opposition to this idea was expanding the city using the satellite method, promoted by Ernst May and his associate Herbert Böhm. Berg planned to decentralize Wrocław to a much greater than the outskirts within the city limits. In Schlesien, he called for the closest suburbs to be associated with the city. Small communes located nearby, such as Osobowice, Różanka, Krzyki, and other towns with great landscape values, such as Sobótka or Leśnica. Both Wrocław and individual towns would benefit from such a system. Wrocław would benefit from the income taxes of these towns, and they would strengthen their position and gain influence over shaping the urban plan, greenery, and communication. First of all, they would influence the field policy, thus preventing the destruction of the landscape by unplanned parceling result from the land speculation. Berg believed that any suburb closer or farther could be considered a part of a big city by building fast transport connections. He devoted special attention to the region of Ślęża. Berg prepared a settlement plan for the entire region. Together with Polheim, he prepared a design for the development of Sobótka as an example of complete specially mature concept supported by perspective sketches. Its time of decentralization by Berg coincides with the construction of the first so-called garden cities near Wrocław, such as Biskupin or Karłowice. The last project was supported by the government, as evidenced by the person responsible for the whole, Paul Schmidheiner, who was an architect at the Ministry of the Interior in Berlin. He was also the result of efforts of the German Werkbund and Gartenstadtgesellschaft. The project of the Garden City of Karłowice included a developed program for public buildings, which were to be concentrated around the planned market square. The author of the urban plan, Paul Schmidheiner, the principal architect of the Wrocław branch of Eigenheim Baugesellschaft, moved to Karłowice to oversee the proper implementation of the project. The original plan by Schmidheiner has probably not survived. A sufficiently precise idea of the intended layout of the streets and squares is provided by a fragment of the plan in Wrocław from 1930. The central axis of the foundation was Kasprowicza Street, along which there were beautiful gardens at the beginning of the century. Investors from the Frankfurt Company, Eigenheim Baugesellschaft, had the chance to introduce a completely new architecture to Wrocław. They could create the first urban space here, in line with the concept of the garden cities translated by German architects. Paul Schmidheiner's aspiration and the serious approach to the whole project were evidenced by the involvement of great authorities from the architectural world, such as Hans Pelzig and Hermann Muthesius. They supported important design activities undertaken with Karłowice, In 1930s, they were invited to work on the jury of the competition for the Market Square. The winning design of Willy Hoffmann from Wrocław was never realized, and the market was built according to the design of Erich Grau. The works were completed in the 1920s. For Schmidt-Henner, Gartenstadt Karlowitz was the first independent project, and the construction of which he could use already gained experience, but above all tried out new ideas regarding to the introduction of the housing module and the creation of the consistent and the homogeneous urban layout in Karłowice. Unfortunately, it has not fully worked out. Schmidt-Henner left the city due to the conflict with the management of the Angerheim Baugesellschaft, mainly due to the architect's innovative concept, ideas of the social housing, and the desire to introduce simplification to standardize all buildings. It was against the company's idea to build a villa according to the taste of the future owners. After this affront, Schmidt-Henner, having the support and the recommendation of Hans Persig, left for Berlin, when he became the first architect of the Stacken housing estate, planned for the employees of the ammunition factory. The name Gartenstadt Karlowitz appeared on the plans in Wrocław in 1930. It functioned after World War I, when Karłowice began to transform into a residential district with heterogeneous architecture, without a well-thought-out urban plan. Ernst May's idea of developing Wrocław using satellites opposed Berg's ideas. In 1921, Wrocław municipality announced a competition for the concept of the development plan for the city and its suburbs. Many of the submitted works presented the latest trends in the effective use of construction land in large city housing construction. Instead of garden estates with 1- and 2-family houses, single-story buildings, which were considered as an ideal solution for 2 decades, the concept of apartment in multi-story buildings with extensive green areas appeared. Ernst May and his colleague Herbert Böhm, however, proposed the following the example of Raymond Unwin's Garden City to move the expansion into the zone of newly raised housing estates, which satellites with their infrastructure would surround the hometown at a distance of 20 to 40 kilometers. As the manager of the Schleswig-Holstein, May supported rural and suburban connection to the municipalities near Wrocław, which was a vigorous defense of the county's interests. At the same time, as a student of Unwin and the socialist, he promoted the model of the city expansion, which, in his opinion, gave the inhabitants only a chance of healthy existence. He argued that Wrocław and the suburban communes were not closely related in terms of economy and construction to create one large commune necessarily. According to ideas of Howard and Unwin, both the home city and the satellite cities should be spatially limited. Satellite organisms surrounded by the green areas with about 5,000 inhabitants would play the role of the industrial and residential towns with their flood zone and basic administrative, economic and cultural facilities. Convenient communication with the central city would be connected. May proposed a solution to communication problems with a special bus. The May concept, although not awarded, gained publicity in Europe, and the invitation of Peter Behrens and Hermann Muthesius, Unwin himself gave a lecture in Berlin on the development of cities using the satellite method, illustrating with the May competition project. Ultimately, the master plan developed based on the competition designs by Fritz Behrens showed that one of the essential tasks in planning a city is to reconcile the tendency to decentralize with the tendency to combine its elements. Wrocław in the interwar period appears to be a testing ground for initiative urban activities, both in the city of the theory and practice. Despite the lack of the victory from May and his great satellite cities, the Garden City movement originated in England also brought products to Wrocław. According to Howard's concept, garden cities are appreciated by the inhabitants who enjoy the charms of life in the city, while admiring the beauty of nearby nature and timeless architecture. The idea of the city of the garden positively stood the test of time. Its value was appreciated by including individual garden cities on the City of Monuments list. Some of them, like Falkenberg in Berlin, are even on the UNESCO list. These solutions were used all over Europe, but most often appeared in Germany.